reconstruct mean?
To rebuild.
Okay, rebuild. So Reconstruction is the rebuilding of what?
Union.
Well, the South and the Union. You're both wrong. Because we have two nations have to come back together. We have to build back there. But they have to physically reconstruct the South. Now, the biggest question of all, what to do with the South? The people that went away, the southern states that went away, does the United States say, oh, come on in? Do we punish them? All right, how do you do when you have rebellious children? And that's basically what the Southerners were. We were some rebellious children. South Carolina leaves, and so do some other children. Are you going to punish them, or are you going to be the consoling parent, and get the prodigal son, for those of you that know with the Bible? Okay, but is it one that you're going to welcome them back? And that is the whole question. Put yourself in a northern family's shoes. Your son, might be your husband, has died or had, as we know, so many amputations and has come back. Are you one that says, oh, let's just forgive the South? Or do you want to punish him? Put yourself in Charles Sumner's shoes or his head. Are you one that wants to go and forgive the South and say, oh, welcome back? So this is where you have this. Now, our first plan that we would have would be Lincoln's 10% plan. And I know I mentioned before in here, and I'm not going into real detail for these parts, and be glad that I'm not in there. The 10% plan was an easy plan. The 10% plan says that if 10% of the Southerners give an oath of loyalty, you're back in. And except for some of the very highest ranking officials, everyone else, you're forgiven. So even if you served in the military, as long as you weren't a high-ranking officer, welcome back.
What happens to the people that were high-ranking officers?
That's where there was some questions. There would be some things that someone's going to have to pay the price. Lincoln's not going to let everybody get off scot-free, but for the most part, it is an easy plan.
So, okay, the 10% of just the normal people? Or?
Yeah, the 10% basically of citizens. Go raise their right hand and basically give a oath of loyalty to the United States. And
everybody's allowed back in, right?
Yeah, the whole states are back in. And what would end up happening, though, is that the Congress would say, no, we're not going to do this. Congress says we make the laws. They made their own plan, which was called the Wade-Davis Bill. It was harder than it. They actually had it where it was going to have to be 50%. In all reality, that's not even that hard. And some people said, wait, this is too easy. Lincoln had it where he killed it with a pocket veto. Now, those of you that know with how a bill becomes a law, anyone know what a pocket veto is? Here's a little mini government lesson in here.
Oh, he didn't do anything with it. He just held it aside so they couldn't bring it anywhere, right?
Right. Our founding fathers put it was actually, instead of him actually vetoing it, like a president can veto a law and it kills a law, if something is passed near the end of a session of Congress, if the president just doesn't sign it, it dies. Now, if Congress is still in session and the president doesn't sign it, the law automatically goes into being. And it's actually a brilliant thing that our founding fathers did. I mean, I know none of you ever do this. Like, none of you will wait till Wednesday night to do your Brinkley project. But some human beings have a tendency to wait till the last moment to do something. And Congress is the same way. They will wait until the very last moment to pass a law that needs to be passed. Well, they had kind of made a goal, let's make our plan. They make their plan and they pass it at the end. Well, I know that those of you that have friends that do procrastinate and sometimes leave that until the last moment, don't always do their best work when they're just trying to get her done. And that's what happened with Congress. And our founding fathers realized human nature, and they made it for a president that it's not that, like maybe Lincoln wasn't one that truly disagreed with this, but said, no, there's some flaws to this. Okay, I'm going to put it away. When you come back, make a better plan. And we have some different things in there. One of the most debated law that we have right now, Obamacare, was one of those things that they were just kind of trying to throw together so they could get home for Christmas before they left there. And so this is where he did a pocket veto. But he killed it. Yeah.
So pocket veto is basically when you just like set it to a side.
Yeah, and the president, and then what it is it died. It was not going to go. So Lincoln's 10% plan was back in play, except for then we'd have a thing at Ford Theater, and when Lincoln got a really bad headache at Ford Theater, his plan goes away. Who takes over as vice president? Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson's plan was going to be the same as Lincoln's, except for we're going to have to get used to this radical Republicans. That is the Republicans that did not like the CZ plan. The main leaders for the radical Republicans are Thaddeus Stevens and reintroducing Charles Sumner. Radical Republicans are wanting to punish the South. As easy as Lincoln's plan is, they are the other extreme. Yeah.
Wait, going back on the 10%, so 10% of the citizens would be charged with...
No, they won't be charged.
They have to.
10% would just give an oath of loyalty. So you get 1 out of every 10 people to raise their hand and say, we'll be loyal to the United States and welcome back.
What about the 9 others?
It doesn't matter. The state's back in. You're forgiven.
Oh. Okay.
Like I said, Lincoln's plan is pretty easy. Okay. Wade Davis' plan was saying for 50%. It really wasn't harsh. It was harsher than Lincoln's, but it wasn't. Now, the radical Republicans, this is where, when we had the part for Ford's Theater, that John Wilkes Booth, who was killing Lincoln in order to help the South, he actually hurt the South that way.
What do you mean take over?
They're the ones that they take over the plan. They are saying they're going to take over Reconstruction. It's not the president. Johnson, they weren't even going to listen to.
It's kind of off topic, but what happened to the guy that killed Lincoln?
John Wilkes Booth, he was killed.
Was he
Well,
dead?
he was actually they had it right, a barn that was set on fire.
His leg.
Yeah. Well, he broke his leg before. That's where Samuel Mudd set his leg, in there. But this is where he was found, or was he? Okay. We have, of course, there's conspiracies there. Most things point to it. That isn't. Maybe he's on the same island with Kennedy and Tupac, but there they hanging out. All right, but the radical Republicans, they take over, and when I say take over, they're taking over Reconstruction. They're in charge of the plan. They're not going to listen to Johnson because, well, for one thing, he was a Democrat. Remember that Union Party? That's why that part is pretty important. It's not a Republican in there. It is a Democrat. They are Republicans. But remember Stevens and Sumner as the two people, they want to punish the South. Okay, remember him? Not only after the 1866 election, they would control 2/3 of both houses. Why is 2/3 important?
Majority.
It's more than majority. Majority is 1 vote more than 1/2. Here's where you take government in your senior year, but why sometimes I say it's good to take it hand in hand. If a president vetoes a bill, Congress can override it if they have how much of a vote? 2/3. So even if President Johnson says no, doesn't matter. No, they can just over. It's a little technicality, it takes a little time. It's going to be irritating to them that he vetoes it. They have to go through a whole nother vote, but they can do it. Which they would then pass their own plan in 1867. The Reconstruction Act of 1867. Have any idea what the Reconstruction Act of 1867 was about?
Reconstruction.
Yeah, it's Reconstruction. Sometimes it's called the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867. The reason why it's called that is they put the military in charge. Johnson vetoed it, but they have 2/3 of vote. They override the veto, and it goes in, and it makes it where there are military districts. Now, here's a way to go ahead and turn around, and one way to make sure you punish the states. They were fighting for states' rights. Are they even states anymore? No. They take that away from them. Okay? You no longer are Florida. You're part of District 3. Okay? Now, Virginia is its own district there because it's so big in population. But that is where you turn around. You don't elect your own governor. They put different generals in charge. Grant was put in charge of one area. Sherman was in charge of another general that you study the Civil War history. General Sheridan, not Sherman, but it's another, Sheridan was put in charge of. So they put generals in charge of that. They didn't vote for their people. Congress basically chose who they had in charge of it, and they're in charge of that district. That got, again, it kind of seems symbolic, but it is where, it is sometimes like for you all that your parents punish you something on. Really, it isn't that big of a deal, but they know it's going to tick you off. Okay, and it's something that, and that's kind of what the North was doing. They were making sure by, no, you're not a state. I mean, they could have easily have said, here's our 11 states. Even if they put a military person in charge, you don't elect your governor, we're going to put it. But no, we're going to take away even your states there. All right, the end of slavery. Officially ended with what amendment? If you don't know that by now, I'm not sure what you've been doing in here. Okay. Now, eventually you will have a quiz that will have amendments. It'll actually be 12 through 21. There, but if you notice in the notes that we have had, I had the 11th Amendment, which is kind of the one that's always forgotten because that's lawsuits with states, and the 12th Amendment, which was where the president and vice president are elected together. Now we have the 13th Amendment there, but you're going to need to know the 14th Amendment too. But before, we'll get to it in just a second. 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. Then we are going to have the South pass what are called black codes. What these are laws that say, if you are black, you can't do such and such. Which, some examples of that. If you are black, you cannot own land. If you are black, you cannot own a weapon. If you are black, you cannot move. So, here you are, you're free. You're no longer a slave, but you can't move and you can't own land. The only thing you really know how to do is work on a farm, but you're not allowed to move. Whose farm are you going to have to work on?
Your old masters.
Yeah, your old masters, or if not, maybe the plantation next door. So someone else there. So slavery's ended, but has it really ended? Yeah. No, that's all the South did is they just basically changed the terminology.
And what year was the 13th Amendment?
Well, the 13th Amendment was 1865. Sorry, it was when the war ended, that's when it was not the Emancipation Proclamation that officially ended slavery. It was that. But here's where the black codes. The black codes, I had the question, what's the difference between black codes and slavery? Officially, they are different, but unofficially, it's kind of the same thing. If you're not allowed to move, you can't own property. Okay, I mean, it's there. Then you are kind of stuck where you're at. You're not allowed to marry, all right, a white person. Okay, there if you're black. The North would then pass the Civil Rights Act. Now, what the act would say is that you cannot make a law that separates one group from another. Basically, you can't just make a law on one group of people. In other words, in this case, they're saying towards black people. You cannot make one law that way. Johnson vetoes it. They override it.
Does that apply to 1 and 2? Like,
well, and here's where we will have that argument later on. And you're actually jumping a tiny bit ahead, but you're going to see real quick, where women were going to be upset with some of these things that are happening. Remember that lady Elizabeth Cady Stanton? All right, how do you think she's feeling when there's all this fight for things for blacks not only to get civil rights, but then for black men to be able to vote? And you talk about women being able to vote. So we're jumping a little bit ahead.
Was there any gender discrimination within the blacks?
Oh, there would be that also.
So, like, black men were higher than black women.
Pretty much, yeah. It was kind of seen. Again, that were the overall attitudes that we have. Congress realized when they passed this law that because of the way that the Constitution was, it may be deemed unconstitutional. Remember the Dred Scott case? Is that Dred Scott was not a citizen, so he couldn't sue. So they weren't sure about things, but they wanted to make sure it was even stronger, and they couldn't have another Congress go and make a new law switching it. So the 14th Amendment was passed, which in all actuality, the 14th Amendment made the Civil Rights Law become part of the Constitution. Now, the 14th Amendment is known as the Civil Rights Amendment. And you see on this sign here, no shall deny any person equal protection of the law. So you cannot make law against one group of people of race, creed, or color. What is creed? Most of you know race and color. What is
religion?
All right, a group of beliefs, religious. That can be religious. It doesn't even have to be religious. The 14th Amendment, other than our Bill of Rights, is actually the one that's used the most for different lawsuits, because there are a lot of times discrimination against different groups. And this is where today, this is the 14th Amendment is one that you have gay and lesbian groups that use the same. You have laws that are separated. If I want to marry my partner, Steve, okay, Steve is my partner, and don't tell my wife about him. But this is where, if I want to marry my partner, Steve, state of Florida says that no, a legal marriage in Florida is only between a man and a woman. So is that going against my 14th Amendment? And this is where we kind of have a legal case. Yes.
Okay, so if the 14th Amendment is like a legitimate, like it's in effect, how come they like separated like in the 50s when they separated like water fountains and stuff?
Okay, and this is where, well actually even before we finish this section of notes, we're going to see that the Supreme Court will rule upon this in their Plessy versus Ferguson. So you're jumping ahead, but good thinking. All right. And this is where I'm trying to go in the chronological order of what's happening here. So, but the 14th Amendment we have, well, first of all, here's the way, kind of think of this chronologically. 13th Amendment, no slavery. Black codes, oh, it's kind of back, but in a different word. Oh, can't do it anymore with the Civil Rights Act. Oh, but we need to make the 14th Amendment. Now, a lot of the 14th Amendment, and this is the little side part, would also give the rules for the South to rejoin the Union. You want to come back, Florida? Here's what you must do. And it basically stated, that's the longer part. That part is still in the Constitution, but doesn't matter today. The other part, no discrimination, race, creed, and color, is still today. But that is where we would have for the 14th Amendment. But we'll get to then when we have what would happen to the next step. All right, impeachment. Notice I kept on saying Johnson was vetoing something. Congress has to override the veto. So now they kind of get upset. I mean, it's a technicality they have to do every time. So they then decide, let's get rid of the problem. Let's get rid of Johnson.
Easy.
Okay, that'll be an easy thing to do. Let's just make a law that we know he'll break there. So they passed the Tenure in Office Act. Here's one of those laws you must know. Probably wasn't even constitutional. The Tenure in Office Act said you cannot remove your advisor without 2/3 of the Senate approving it. Which President Johnson looked at that and said, yeah, right. All right, I can't get advice from somebody, all right, or I can't get rid of an advisor without your approval. So he fires a guy that they knew that he didn't like, Edward Stanton. Now, the way that the impeachment goes, the House brings up the charges and then the Senate will vote it. So the House brings up the impeachment charges. To be impeached doesn't mean that you're kicked out of office. You have to be convicted of it. In many ways, impeachment is like an arrest. So the House has it where he's arrested for breaking what law? The Tenure of Office Act. Did he break that law? Yes. Now, for impeachment, a president has to be, when you're impeached, is for a high crimes, treasons, or high crimes and misdemeanors and treason. Well, is breaking the Tenure of Office Act a high crime? And this is where ultimately what would happen, you would have a trial. You see here's a picture. They actually sold tickets for people to go watch this. All right, democracy in action. So the president is pretty much on trial of did he break this? The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is made as basically the head judge there to make sure the rules are followed. When everything was said and done, and here's where the long story gets at least a little bit shorter, the Senate, by one vote, if one other senator would have voted to impeach him, he would have been kicked out of office. So he was not kicked out of office. There, he stays in office, but it kind of gave the message to Johnson because did he keep vetoing things after that? No, he basically kept his mouth shut, and his last bit in office, that last bit, he was just kind of there.
How many years was
He was president for almost 4 years because Lincoln died real early in the term. This is why Johnson is sometimes seen as one of our worst presidents. He was really ineffective, and in many ways, Johnson was from Tennessee. Tennessee's not even back in the Union, yet a person from their state is as president. He was, most people, when you look at things, probably our most racist president we ever had. All right, even more so than his hero, Andrew Jackson, there. Because Johnson, really, he did not. Now, he did not like, you might look at it, he's a Southerner, he's racist, but he stayed in the Union. All right, doesn't seem. What it was is Johnson is actually, he was a self-made man. He was a tailor, became rich, or not rich, but became, basically supported himself as a tailor, as a sewer. He got elected to office. He did not like how the rich planters in the South could do whatever they wanted, and so when they broke away, he stayed in the Union and stayed as a senator, and then that's where he became vice president, even though his state wasn't even in the Union. Okay, he became vice president. But then he's in charge of Reconstruction if the president is, but the radical Republicans don't like it. I know some of you are like, all right, where's this going? Okay, but instead, they're trying to look where different characters are.
If your state broke away but you didn't want to,
He was able to. Sam Houston actually did too, but I believe Sam Houston ended up dying during the Civil War. But Sam Houston stayed for the state of Texas.
If he was born in Tennessee and during the Civil War, Tennessee technically wasn't part of the United States, couldn't he not be president because he was born in the United States?
And that's where some people looked at things and said, all right, here's where some technicalities are, but yeah.
But when he was born in Tennessee, he was part of it.
Right, and that's where, again, technicalities. In the whole big scheme of things, that's not as important as the fact that what he is doing as president. All right, now for trivia-wise. Johnson's one president that's been impeached, who is our only other president to be impeached. Bill Clinton. Okay, Nixon was never impeached. He would have been, and Nixon probably would have been a president that would have been convicted. He would have been our only president kicked out of office, more likely. But Clinton was impeached. There's actually a lot of correlation with Clinton's impeachment as there was with Johnson's. It was Republicans that did it more for a political reason there, because Clinton's impeachment, his high crime was perjury. What is perjury? Yeah, lying under oath. What did Clinton lie about?
Affair.
An affair, sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky. Is that a high crime or misdemeanor against the United States or treason?
No.
And that's where kind of in Clinton's presidency, what happened when the Senate got there, even though it was controlled by Republicans, it was the same thing as Johnson. A lot of people said, we don't like the guy, we want him out of office, but if we are upholding the Constitution, that's not enough for us to vote to kick him out of office. And that's why for Johnson to get by one vote, all right, he stayed in. All right,
Was he removed from office though?
no, they were never, no president was ever removed from office. We've had two that have been impeached. Again, impeached is like being arrested, but then it's almost like you're acquitted in trial. Okay, if you're acquitted, okay, you're able to.
Okay, if you're impeached, the charges are brought up against you, but
yes,
nothing else. All right.
Right, and this is where the impeach goes through the House, and then the trial goes through the Senate.
Okay. So nothing really bad.
That's why I kind of say this is where, and I mentioned last week about some of you that it's sometimes good to take the AP government at the same time as AP history in that second semester, because a lot of these then it makes sense because you know the government structure with how those things go together. All right, 15th Amendment. Coming back to amendments in here, because I'm kind of trying to keep a little bit of this in chronological order, even though I'm jumping around. All right, the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. And here we have the question, what about the women?
That wasn't very long between this.
No. All right, 5 years later, they're able to vote. Was there any talk about giving women the right to vote? No. Now, in the late 1840s, we had Seneca Falls Convention when women were fighting for the right to vote, and the abolitionists said, listen, we got a moral problem. We will fight for your rights as soon as we end slavery. So women fought then for ending slavery, and slavery was ended in 1865. So what did Elizabeth Cady Stanton, what does she think should be done next?
Women.
Yeah, women should get the right to vote. And then we have the Civil Rights Amendment that comes about. And then we have the 15th Amendment, which gives black men the right to vote. But what about women, whether they're white or black?
They still can't vote.
No, they still can't vote. That's not being discussed along them. And this is where Elizabeth Cady Stanton, some people can read it, she did some writings on things. If you And if you read it today, you will think that she is extremely racist because she was saying you have educated women that will have no rights to vote, meanwhile you have ignorant black men that can vote. And what it was is, you can imagine if you were Stanton and what she had, that she looked at things, she was really disappointed that the promises were not kept to her. There. You had a question over here?
I did. Did they have to own land to vote? Or
No,
did they just
no, that was taken. Remember with the Jackson time period, it was. That's what was taken away. So this is, and again, if they would have probably said that black men and women and all women could vote, then okay, say it would. Which again, later on, women would get the right to vote, but when would women get the right to vote? Which again, we had in our daily thing today. What? 19th Amendment, which anyone know what year that was passed?
1896.
No, 1919.
Close.
First election they could vote in was 1920. 1870, 1920. So there's another 50 years before we're really giving women the right to vote. Do you see why Stanton might be a little upset? Now,
She'd be dead.
and you also, yeah, she was dead. So once again, who's the person that carries the torch after her is Susan B. Anthony, and she'll be dead before they get the right, even though she would do even more fighting for this. And what I mentioned about her writing, please realize when we look back on things, you can't look upon it in eyes of 2012. You have to look at it that time period and the idea that they had social Darwinism. If you read Abraham Lincoln's writing today, you would think that he is very racist. Right? The man who did probably more to end slavery than almost anybody else, if not anybody else in here. But he was one that kind of believed in different races and mentalities.
Was there any rights that the women didn't have besides voting?
That's where a lot of the things still, there were some laws that were made that really didn't give women right, especially in the South, when it came to some of the property rights and inheritance laws and things like that. It wasn't as bad as it was before, because a lot of that got eliminated, but there still were some things. Not to mention there's a lot of laws that are institutional that may not be written in the books. All right, here is where we're kind of going and having some things, and this is not just for this time period. I actually go for Reconstruction and carry it on. Some of these things will go on then for another 100 years. So please, this is where I'm having it, that this is kind of a good segue from things. Now, black men were given the right to vote. In the South, they would do various things to try to stop black men being able to vote. And one thing that I want to emphasize here is power. People don't like to give up power. The planters, that planting class, that had been in charge back in the colonial period, had been in charge in the Revolutionary period, had been in charge in the early 1800s, had been in charge up to the Civil War in the South. Did they still want to be in charge?
Yes.
And one of the things that they would do is it's not just blacks, but a lot of times, and notice here, poor whites. Some of these were ways to also make sure that poor whites didn't have the right to vote. One way that you could stop it were grandfather laws. Anyone know what a grandfather law is? No, that's where you have a grandfather clause. You're thinking legally, grandfather clause means like if we pass a sign ordinance where you're not allowed to put a billboard inside the city limits, but if you already have one there, you're grandfathered in. You just can't build any new ones. But that's not with this.
Your ancestry. No, I don't know.
You're actually thinking about it. If your grandfather couldn't vote, you can't vote.
Oh.
Now, so yes, you got the right to vote. Again, it's kind of like the black codes. If your grandfather was a slave, was he able to vote?
No.
So can you vote?
No.
That's a weird.
And will your grandson be able to vote? No.
No one will ever be able to
That's messed
vote.
up.
Well, if your grandfather was a poor white man, and when they used to have property things, and he probably couldn't vote, then would you be able to vote?
No.
So they were able to get some poor whites that they were not able to vote. So where is the power staying? Yeah, with the rich and the planter class in the South.
Was that passed?
All right, what?
Or was your grandfather law?
Oh, I don't know.
No.
All right, poll taxes. When you see poll, not only is it like a survey, but a poll is also a voting place. Like tomorrow, people will go to the polls. So a poll tax is a tax to charge people to vote.
Do they still have that?
No.
Oh,
Or actually, an argument we have in this day is whether or not if voter IDs is a poll tax. If you had to pay to get an ID, if you were like some of you have driver's license, but if you didn't have a driver's license, if you wanted to vote and you were 18, you've got to have some sort of ID. Well, if they're charging you to have that, then that's where a legal argument is. Is that a poll tax? Now, you might look at things and say that, okay, well, you should have it. You pay an extra tax a year. But let's say, put in today's terms. If we were to go and say it's going to cost you $5,000 a year for the right to vote.
What?
How many people in Citrus County out of 130,000 people, how many people are going to pay $5,000 a year?
2.
a few old people.
1.5.
Old
All
people.
the doctors. I don't know, 'cause they probably
It won't be a high percentage, but here's where some people look at it as a business investment. If you are rich, you might want to vote because are you going to have a say-so of who's making the laws?
We'll definitely see.
If your family's in construction, would you probably pay to vote?
Yeah.
Yeah, because who makes our building ordinances? The commissioners. Are you going to make sure you got commissioners in office that are friendly to you?
Yeah.
If you are a landowner and you're there, you would make sure that you vote because you're the one that elects the sheriff. Is the sheriff a little more likely to take care of and protect your property than the non-voters?
Yeah.
But for the most part, who's going to be the ones paying to vote?
The rich.
The rich. Which, whether they are white or black, was that a way to stop people from voting in the South?
Yeah.
Poll taxes would later on, it would be in the 1960s. So again, almost 100 years later, it would be deemed unconstitutional. A literacy test. Anyone know what a literacy test is? But the thing was, it wasn't that could you read or write. All right, they had tests to see that you know stuff about government.
Which I think they
Now,
should do that.
and there is, and you see, I think I have in your notes, there's actually a court case which they said that was legal. The thing is it wasn't given out in a certain way, since we have our line of males, because women can't vote right now. All right, Dylan, here he is. He comes up to vote tomorrow. He comes to vote and say, who was the first president of the United States?
George Washington.
Okay, you can go vote. All right, our next Dylan. Who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy to Woodrow Wilson during World War I? All right, you can't vote. What are the two main political parties today?
Democrats, Republicans?
Okay, go ahead and vote. Okay. Who was the Secretary of State during President Johnson's term?
I don't know.
Okay, you can't vote. No, they're all government questions, right?
That's weird.
Could I give one question to one person, another one? Or if you looked at things, oh, well, you combine the two together with the grandfather clauses. There. So, and I'll tell you what, I'd be a person, I really think we should have literacy tests today, because we got a lot of stupid people that vote.
Did you see the morning
But-
this morning? The morning show?
But most places don't.
That was
Oh,
so
yeah.
ridiculous.
What was on the morning show?
Hillary Clinton.
Oh,
gosh.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, for another way to keep people from voting, though, was intimidation. And here's where we're going to have the introduction to a group of people that helped make the sales of bed sheets increase dramatically in the United States. Okay. It was a conspiracy among linen manufacturers there to have the KKK. But this is where for intimidation would be a way that Southerners would try to stop it. All right, last slide we'll do real quick here. The Freedmen's Bureau. 1865 it was established. Notice what the name is. Freedmen. So who is the freedmen?
Slaves.
The freed slaves. This was established to help slaves. It was extremely good in many ways, except for what happened is, as we got further away from the Civil War, the funding was cut for it, the support for it was cut. Our American forefathers were like us. They were ADD. Okay, after just a little bit of time, did they forget what was going on?
Yeah.
Okay, how many of you pay attention to what's happening in Afghanistan right now?
Nobody.
Okay, and most Americans have no idea what's happened in the past 2 weeks in Afghanistan. Okay, unless you have family that's directly there, it's kind of Out of sight, out of mind. Okay, it's not something that's brand new. Okay, and the same thing happened during Reconstruction. Freedmen's Bureau, people supported in the beginning. Then after that, 2-3 years later, oh, that's still around? Why are we even paying money for that? Okay, and that's where people kind of forgot. Now, it was to help out them. The first thing in the original part, it had it where they would take over the land, and this is where some people thought they were going to have, for a lot of slaves, they were promised 40 acres and a mule. Now, former slaves knew how to do what for most of them? Farm. So, if you were to go and take these plantations and divide up into 40 acres, why does a mule matter? Okay, that's where you need a beast of burden to work on a farm. So if you were to go and divide this up and get 40 acres to the mule, except for most places that happened. No, slaves weren't given any land. In most places what ultimately happened is those Southerners that had the land, owned it before, they still kept their land. So the rich kept it. They didn't have much money in the bank, but they still had the land. But then President Johnson pardoned the Confederates and they got all their land back. Now what happened with the Freedmen's Bureau? There are some successes that it had early on. It came to the South and tried to establish public schools. Most places in the South didn't have public schools. And what's really, you look at things that helped out the South, whites and blacks, the Freedmen's Bureau did. Because we established some public education in the school. We also established hospitals. One of the things that it did that was successful that a lot of times is forgotten about, but it is true with it, it reunited a lot of the families. Because when you had family members that were sold off to slavery in different areas, trying to unite them together. But the long-lasting effect that we'd have would be with schools. But the idea that the Freedmen's Bureau had in the beginning ended up getting cut out pretty much early into Reconstruction. All right, so that'll be Reconstruction. Two names you need to know, Scalawags and Carpetbaggers. The Scalawags were Southerners who were for the Republican Party. Now, if we want to look at that in today's terms, we got a bunch of Scalawags. That is the heart of the Republican Party today is now in the South. But that wasn't true in those days. But they joined the Republicans. I say they are mainly small farmers. Here's where you have to go back and think back to the Old South. What group of people controlled everything in the South? Yeah, those rich plantation owners. So if you were a smaller farmer, you're on your own. You are, basically you think about it, a farmer is their own independent worker. But you are on your own, and you always get things where you're not able to do stuff legally because the plantation owners, they get what they want. So these are people that would end up then going and joining with the Republicans because they want to see some sort of change. They're tired of basically, today we call it the good old boy network, being able to do whatever they want, whether it be corruption or not. Then we have carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers got a really bad name. Some carpetbaggers were bad. Some of them were really good. Now, you see this little cartoon that they usually look like they're little scoundrels. Now the name carpetbagger comes from, at that time, a cheap way to make luggage is you would take an old carpet that was worn, turn it inside out, basically sew it up and put a handle on it. Okay, so it's cheap luggage. But they were moved to the South. Now some of them came down to take advantage of the South being in disarray. Some of them came down to help people, almost like missionaries. Some of them came down for business reasons. If the South is in disarray, you've got a little bit of extra money. Would that be a good place to go and start a lumber mill? And so that's why some people did. And yes, they made money off the Southerners, but they also helped them out because those Southerners may not have had money to start that lumber mill to rebuild. So that is where not all carpetbaggers were bad. But what we end up happening is you have the freedmen, these are the freed slaves, the scalawags, and carpetbaggers. They kind of all join in together, and they all support Republicans. And we end up with some Republicans then getting elected. And actually through the Reconstruction in the South, they would. Now here is trivial information. If you can remember, it's great, but I'll tell you, this is more trivia than anything else. Our first two black senators are Hiram Revels and then Blanche Bruce. They weren't senators for very long. I believe Hiram Rebels even took the seat that was occupied before by Jefferson Davis. Alright, it's kind of ironic that that's when it was the person that came back to replace him. But it does show that here we are, less than 10 years after the South seceded, and we have African Americans that are being elected into the Senate. Right, Scalawags and Carpetbaggers combined with the Freedmen. It was a coalition with them. Then you would have the Democrats, where most of the Southern whites were. But again, some Southern whites were the Scalawags. If a person was called a carpetbagger or a scalawag by most Southerners, that was not seen as something good to be shown. As Democrats regained their power, these groups would then lose it, and eventually we'll have, when we get to redemption, when the Democrats would redeem power there. All right, the Southern economy. You see this picture, and you saw some other pictures that we have. I mean, there were places that physically had to be reconstructed because entire cities were destroyed. But the economy was in shambles. A lot of people had invested their money in the Confederate bonds, a loan to the federal government. Is the U.S. government going to go and recognize that money? No. Sorry, if you used your money to buy Confederate bonds, you lost it. So for a lot of rich Southerners, they really were without hardly anything. They were rich beforehand, but they invested in the Confederate government. They lost their slaves. Were they reimbursed for the value of their slaves? No. What was the one thing that they had though? Their land. They still owned the land. Now, for some people, this is what some of the radical Republicans really wanted to push for is take that land that those rich Southerners had and split it up, and remember that whole 40 acres of a mule. Give it to the former slaves, and split it up for each of them to have it. Why does Georgia and South Carolina have so much damage? Yeah, the march to the sea. Okay, it actually wasn't as much fighting there. It was the physical damage that Sherman did. Virginia would have a lot because of the fighting that occurred there. Same property values are much lower. There are a whole lot of people wanting to buy land in the South right now. There must be people that have money to buy land in the South. And this is where for some people, if you were a carpetbagger, if you had some extra money, you moved from the North and moved to the South, could you buy yourself a nice piece of land? And this is and even in Florida we would have that. In some places they would buy thousands of acres because you could get it extremely cheap. And so that's why some of our carpetbaggers would do that. And the cotton prices are lower because India, Egypt now is growing more cotton. They started before the Civil War, and during the Civil War they expanded it there. So when the South starts growing more cotton, there's more supply out there, the price of cotton's lower. And all they do is they actually lower the price more, and then they keep growing more and more. Here are the main words that you do need to know, and this is where we come to the vocabulary, and I know this is not a real exciting part. Sharecropping and tenant farming. The Southern plantation owners own the land. And what they would do, and if you hear the terms about, especially like a child of a sharecropper or a grandchild of a sharecropper, they no longer had slaves, but a lot of and it's not just blacks, there would be poor whites that would be sharecroppers too, but it would be a lot of the freed blacks. They would go and in order to be a sharecropper, because I want to be the rich person, I'm going to be now the old plantation owner. I got a couple thousand acres. All of you out here, well, you don't know how to do much but farm. But you don't have any land of your own. So what I might do is start dividing up my land. And Connor, here you've got 25 acres. All right, you've got 25 acres, and basically give you 25, 50 acres, depending on what you're growing. Now, sharecropping. What happens is I take a share of your crops that you grow. So there's a little shack you all living on. You're growing land. Now the thing is for sharecropping is I get the first share. So let's say you're growing corn. I'll say I get the first 150 bushels. After that, you get whatever you want. So even if it's a bad year, you're probably still going to get at least 150 bushels. I get that 150 bushels. You don't get very much. Now, if it's a really good year, I still get 150 bushels. You get a lot more. And so you made some extra money. If you could get then from sharecropping, the next level you go to is tenant farming. Anyone know what a tenant is?
Somebody living with you, like living on your property.
All right, they're living on your property, a renter. So realistically, this is a person that is renting it. So Connor, instead of sharecropping, this year he's finally made a little extra money. He now goes and says, and basically we work out a deal for him to be a tenant farmer. So he's going to pay me rent beforehand. So he pays me $100 and he's got that farm for a year. Now, if he does good enough, then that first $150, you get to keep it. You get to keep all of what you grow, but you have to pay me beforehand. If things go really good for you for a couple of years, you may not have to rent from me anymore. You might even come to me and want to try to buy that land. Or you might go somewhere else and buy land. But what happens if he rented from me and that year we have a major drought come through?
Then he has to go back to sharecropping.
He goes back to being a sharecropper. And it was real hard to get out of that cycle. But you notice with all of this, who's making money every year? Yeah, the plantation owner. I'm making the money. We would also have what's sometimes called a crop lien system. We're going to find this happens out west for a lot of places for what they would do for poor people, especially people of Mexican descent. What happens with the crop lien system is, you all work for me, but I have almost like a store that you buy all your stuff from. You live in the houses that I own, so you're going to pay me rent. You shop from the store that I own, and you work off your debt. Except for,
I don't pay you enough.
if you never actually work off your debt, are you ever allowed to leave?
Nope.
So even though slavery was illegal, did I kind of make you my slave? If you always owe me money, you can't leave till you pay off your debt. And that was one system that happened. It happened in the South. It would again happen mainly out west, and a lot of times with Mexican Americans, and later on in history. All right, bourbon rule. I know none of you know of anything about alcohol at all. All right, so I see smirks from some of you. Okay, but what is the difference between whiskey and bourbon?
They taste different.
They all taste awful.
Why does it age longer?
Well, it's aged longer, and also with some of the things that you do in the barrels, like the charred barrels and things that you can do with it. Bourbon is a little more expensive. And again, the aging that you have, usually in the charred barrels, it'll be more expensive. So the richer Southerners would be drinking bourbon, where a poorer Southern will be drinking the whiskey. So what is bourbon rule?
Like the rich people?
Yeah, the richer people are ruling. Now, these rich people, did they always have to be Southern?
No.
Could the bourbon rule been by a carpetbagger that came down to the area and bought a couple thousand acres, and now this person is owning the land?
Yeah.
So now that didn't happen a lot of times, but some places it did. All right, Henry Grady. I don't know. This is something that I'm trying not to go too deep in all these, but this is one person you have. Henry Grady wrote for the Atlanta Constitution. Now, those of you that are Southern, you kind of know that the capital of the South is not Richmond, is not Montgomery, but in the modern South, even today, the capital of the South is Atlanta. All right, where does the SEC play their championship game? All right, it's in Atlanta. I mean, that's the heart of the South, is Atlanta, Georgia. Well, he wrote in the Atlanta Constitution, and he wrote about what the South needed to do. And realistically, if the South would have listened to what Henry Grady was said, the next 50 to 100 years would have been a lot better. But he said they need to develop their own economy, not just grow cotton. They need to go and put textile mills, and they need to make things out of it. They need to get it where they're not based so much on straight out agriculture. But is that what they did? And what would happen for the next 100 years for the South? Yeah, it would be. Meanwhile, what is going on in the North economy during this time?
They're getting rich.
It is getting better and better. All that industry that's going on. Our next section, we'll have like one little section in the South, which basically they're growing more crops. In the North, we have the factories. We have, out west, our first section we're doing in our next unit is with cowboys and Indians and farmers. Okay, Why is it that we have our cowboys and cattle drives? Is to send meat out to the cities there. Okay. All right, the KKK. Yeah.
Henry Reid.
Right.
What do you say they should do with their economy?
Basically, he was saying he needs to diversify. Would be, if you want to put one word in there, is to diversify, not have it where it's based totally on agriculture. Again, the best example I give, which would actually come about, but about 70 years later, he was saying build textile mills. Don't ship the cotton away. Take the cotton right there, which in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we will have a lot of our shirt factories and things that were made, and carpet factories made in Georgia, North Carolina. Of course, what happened to those now in the last couple decades? Those areas still have a whole lot of textile mills? Where are a lot of your clothes made?
China.
Pakistan.
Well, China's not even making as much of your clothes because there's not as much money as there. They go to Pakistan, India, Dominican Republic.
Taiwan.
So, not even Taiwan. Taiwan's usually higher, but basically outlying areas there. All right, the KKK.
Yeah.
Here's where most people don't realize it. The KKK started out as an organization against the Republican Party.
Really?
Yeah, that's how it started out. It was actually a social organization. Nathan Bedford Forrest, okay, the great-great-granddaddy of Forrest Gump. That's who Forrest Gump is named after.
Who?
Forrest Gump.
Racist.
But for Forrest, that's why Forrest Gump is spelt the way that Nathan Bedford Forrest was. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a former cavalry general for the Confederacy. He's actually a very good general. But he would found this. It was almost like a social organization. He later on would go to denounce it. Because when it became, and realistically, the KKK, today we would say it is a terrorist organization.
Why do they wear sheets?
Well, part of it was to hide, and there is actually stories and all about behind where the cross comes in, the burning cross, and a lot of things were done using Christianity there to make things pure. The original KKK, they did not hide their face, and later on, and you're going to see there was going to be emergence of them the time they'd have, but for a short period. There's another group that actually is still sort of around today, the White Chameleon Knights. They're even more radical. The leader of the White Knights here in Florida, he used to be a janitor over at CF in Ocala. Lived in Micanopy, okay, but he was the Archduke of them. Got kicked out of the KKK because he was too extreme with his views. That kind of tells you with a person, if you're too extreme, that the KKK kicks you out. But yeah, he was a janitor at CF, lived over in Micanopy. I don't even remember what all this stuff was.
White Knights coincidental, or are they like a
It's the White Chameleon Knights. It's I'm not sure. I'm not. Camellias. The camellia seen is a flower. It's a southern flower, kind of like the azalea is. So you have the camellia. So I truthfully don't even know the background with that part. But that's another group. It's not just the KKK. The main point for here in history is we have a time period that this is where they emerge.
Are the Black Panthers considered like a terrorist group too?
Yeah, you basically, it's the idea.
They're not more known.
Well, they had their time period that they were. Now we have the new Black Panthers, but
What's that?
it's another group that's
What
trying
is
to
Black
go.
Panther?
Well, let's say in this time period right now. All right, the KKK quickly comes to power. They are using intimidation. They're trying to stop the people from voting for Republicans. And what ends up being passed then is the Enforcement Act. One thing that President Grant would do, he doesn't have a very good presidency overall, but one thing that Grant does is he basically squashes the KKK. All right, they come to power for a very short time period, and he puts them down. He sends in the military. He doesn't eradicate it, but for the most part, he does. Now, it's going to reemerge in the 1920s, and that's actually when the KKK is more important in American history, not right after the Civil War. We're going to have a movie that would turn around and glorify the KKK that was made in 1915, I believe was the year of it, and it would glorify the KKK, and then in the 1920s, it is seen as this American type group. the chat. That's why you kind of have to be careful when people go and start preaching about American and don't be socialist and all that, and you use words, and suddenly you'll see that you try to get things, and we get nationalism. That should happen. All right, Ida B. Wells, just remember her along the way that she has it where she starts anti-lynching campaign. Now, what does it mean to lynch a person? Yeah, hang them without a trial. Why would the KKK, the White Knights, and other groups hang a person without a trial? It's a scare tactic. Okay, and so if you have a person that's going to vote for a Republican, and you hang them, are some other people going to go and vote?
No.
And this is where we would have the politics that was happening. And notice the years on this that we have is we're getting 5 years out from the end of the Civil War. So as we get a little bit further out. All right, Reconstruction in the North. I'm not going to spend a long time on this because we're going to go into the Gilded Age at that time. One thing, though, that we have is a lot of corruption up north. This is one scandal. You're going to see it come up again. The Credit Mobilier scandal is the most famous of all the scandals. What happened? This had involved railroad companies and government land. And what you're going to find with scandal after scandal is somebody in the government is skimming money off the top. All right, we're using graph. Whiskey ring, Navy ring, Indian ring. The whiskey ring was where people that were supposed to collect taxes on whiskey were taking money off the top. The Navy ring is they were getting contracts for stuff in the Navy, and when something that might have cost $5, then they would buy it for $50. All right, and the Indian ring was when money was supposed to go for these Indians that were going to be put on reservations. Well, you know, do we really need to send that money to those Indians? The people were skimming off all the way. But the reason why this is important for the Reconstruction is if you read in the news one corruption after another and one scandal after another, you get tired of seeing bad things happening with government.
Yeah.
And this is where that would start getting on people as Reconstruction is going on. We would then have the Panic of 1873. What's a panic?
Recession.
Okay, a recession or a depression. What this is caused by railroad speculation. We kept building a whole bunch of railroads. Those of you that have been watching the great men or the men that built America, this was a time period that when things go down, smart men with money and smart people with money figure out, hey, now's the time to invest. And that's where you have it, where it's kind of the Darwin theory, and this is where social Darwinism really takes in. But the reason why, we're now 8 years out at the end of the Civil War. If a lot of people are losing their jobs, and you're reading in the news about scandal after scandal, do you really care about going and punishing the South anymore? And that is where we will end up having it. Oh, one other thing that happens here. Waving the bloody shirt. For the Republicans, as times are going, and some people are not wanting to punish as much as Sumner and Stevens are. Well, one way to get it when you had a vote is, and it started, one time it was literally done. A person brings in this shirt that had blood stains on it to get the Republicans to all vote together, because you've got to go against where these Democrats, and they supported it, and this person died. And so it was kind of symbolic, but this is where periodically, whenever the Republicans would go to split, you would use that to join them together. Today, Republicans, all they have to do is say Obamacare. Okay, that's their bloody shirt of today, to unite Republicans in together.
How do the scandals make people not care about Reconstruction more? Like,
what happens is, again, we as Americans, and even back in the 1870s, we have a short attention span. So for a while there, we got to punish the South. But after year after year after year, and you have the stuff in the scandals in the news. All right, and now the stuff for Reconstruction, that's way back there. Do we really need our army down in the South forcing these people to do this?
What are the punishments that they have besides being districts?
Well, they are not. A lot of their rights have been taken away. We have not given them. They have to do, according to the 14th Amendment, there's certain things they have to do before we'll give them their civil rights back. A lot of them still aren't able to vote along the way. So as time goes along, we give more and more of them right to vote. You'll see a word come up here, amnesty. We give them amnesty. Because here's the question that had come with it. If Mikey was a general in the Civil War for the Confederacy, well, we know he did something major. But what if he's just a person that was drafted by the Confederate States of America? He was told by his state, you got to go fight. How long should he be punished for doing what his government told him he was supposed to do? And that's where the question kind of comes. And for a lot of people up north, okay, if you're just a regular soldier, why should he not be allowed to vote? Why should he not be allowed to do this stuff when we're talking 5 years, 6 years, 7 years out of the way? I mean, it's one thing when you're talking about Henry Wirtz, who all these people died at Andersonville, but for your common soldiers, okay, and how high do you go up? All right, but that's what the overall theme for all these things is. People got tired of stuff with Reconstruction. Again, we in America, squirrel, okay, we get distracted. All right, one thing, I'm kind of throwing this in here. We're going to see social Darwinism in the next year with businesses. But a lot of people in the North also believed in this when it came to race. And this is where if you read Abraham Lincoln's writings, and you will see that he believed that some races were more superior to others. And this was an argument they were having. You're going to see that with Andrew Johnson. We won't have time to show the video today for the video for Johnson for his presidency. But that's where you're going to kind of see with him, is even though he didn't like slavery, all right, he did not, it wasn't that he believed in equality among people. All right, redemption. First of all, the Amnesty Act. By 1872, 7 years after the war, basically everybody was forgiven except for about the top 500 people. So it took 7 years to do pretty much what Abraham Lincoln was wanting to do in the first couple of months. The Democrats would take over the government. That's what redemption means, which is redeemer governments. Now, you're going to see, if you ever hear this term later on in history, yeller dog Democrats. I know it's yellow dog, but we've got to say yeller dogs, just like yeller wood. But the yellow dog Democrats, for the longest time in the South, the saying was, you would vote for the old yeller dog before you'd ever vote for a Republican. The Republicans were the party of Lincoln. That was the party of the North. Now we're going to see, and this is where a change in history is going to occur, what president would change things around, and it wouldn't be overnight, but over a couple decades we would flip-flop from black Americans voting Republican to voting Democrat, and Southern whites voting, not all, but going from being Democrats to being Republican. What? No, he was never president. Not Obama. Franklin Roosevelt.
Why?
And this is where you're going to see what ends up happening. And Franklin Roosevelt would end up changing politics, and where groups of votes would happen. And during the 50s and the 60s, what would end up happening? Remember back to your bracketing dates, a key year in that will be 1948, the Dixiecrats. So but this is where, but up to that, but basically up to 1948. Okay, you look at things that we have, the yellow dog Democrats, and again, you'd vote for the old yellow dog before you'd ever vote for a Republican if you were a good Southerner. All right, the election of 1876, yesterday we had this with Samuel Tilden in the People Reports. Tilden won the election, but there were 3 states that were up for grabs because there was corruption. The compromise of 1877 would give these 3 states to the Republicans. The Republicans were doing anything to be able to keep the office of presidency, so they were willing to give up Reconstruction. And once that happens, and Hayes is the winner, which then they had a nickname of Brother Fraud, instead of Rutherford, but Fraud Hayes there. But Reconstruction ends. Now there's an old saying as for Reconstruction. When Reconstruction ended, the army marched out and Jim Crow walks in. Who is Jim Crow?
Black laws.
They're like black laws, but they are different. And here's where, and that's one of the biggest mistakes, and this is where, and I'll tell you this, for some of you, and I already saw it in one of your reflection questions already, segregation and slavery are 2 separate things, okay? And please, the worst thing that anybody ever wants to read for history is to read about how Martin Luther King Jr. was preaching against slavery. Okay, you're 100 years off. Please know the difference between slavery and segregation. All right, where a lot of times I say you don't have to be exact on everything, you better not make that mistake. Okay, because that kind of makes you look like you have no idea what you're talking about there. And it's a simple mistake to make, but don't make that mistake. But what would happen is we would end up having Jim Crow laws then. But a couple of things. And here we'll go, Jim. Jim Crow laws are segregation laws. And I put that quote, as the Army marched out, Jim Crow marched in. The part that I have above there, though, and we still got people in our parking lot doing this, but we have the lost cause. Okay, for some people, the Civil War did not end. And what happened throughout the South is, and you've got to realize the psychological side for the South. When 1 out of every 5 males was either killed or wounded, so you have a lot of people that have their father, their brother, their husband that does not return, or they return and they have an amputated limb. And some of this is the South, and they started looking back to the old South. And when people look back at the good old days, you forget the bad stuff. And they started thinking about, oh, the chivalry of the South and how, oh, they treated women better. Okay? And so this is where you end up with that last cause. All right, Redeemer governments. This is where it said redemption. This is where sometimes they're called Redeemer governments. The South is then democratically controlled. What would happen with it, and this is where for segregation, I'm kind of jumping in, this is kind of our segue to our next section here. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 would allow segregation laws. The key thing, and someone, I think Taylor, you were asking about this yesterday. Plessy versus Ferguson said separate but equal. Now the South would realize that separate side. Would they make things equal for the next 60 years?
Kind of.
Okay, and that is where when we would have things but the Supreme Court would allow separate but equal. And Plessy versus Ferguson, you need to know that quote with them. Just like when you see Marbury versus Madison, all right, you automatically think about deeming the law unconstitutional or judicial review. Okay, separate but equal has to go with Plessy versus Ferguson, and it goes straight with the Jim Crow laws. And then we're going to have one guy that you're going to see in here, Booker T. Washington. And we're going to have him in the People Reports next week. But Booker T. Washington gave a speech that sounded as if today that he was accepting segregation, but that's not what he was actually aiming for. But he gave on the Atlanta Compromise, and remember him with there, and again, that'll be a section that we're going to go deeper into. But he had the idea of a self-help in education. He would be leading what would be the Tuskegee Institute and showing that in the South. And now we get in that section, which again, that last part, most of that we'll have a little bit later on.
What's the speech called?
The Atlanta Compromise.
It's called
And Lexi, go ahead and they want you to explain it.